Hey guys, this is Philosophossum, and I was thinking the other day, it's been a pretty long time since I've taken on a Suris video, so I thought I'd swing by his channel and see what he's been up to lately, and one video in particular sort of stood out to me. Suris actually made a video criticizing the policies of Jo Jorgensen. In case you're not familiar with who that is, she's the candidate running for the Libertarian Party during the last election, and while being libertarian myself, naturally this caught my interest. So I figured, this ought to be good, let's have a look at it. Oftentimes when I make these response videos, I like to take a quick minute to look at the thumbnail before actually getting into the video, because this can often give us an idea of what the general theme of the video is going to be, or what the general mentality is of the person making the video before we actually get into it. Basically, it gives us a brief idea of what exactly it is we're getting ourselves into here. So the thumbnail depicts a picture of Jo Jorgensen with a speech bubble coming out saying, "If you're poor, sucks to be you." The implication here is fairly obvious. He's trying to imply that she doesn't care about the poor. So I haven't actually watched this yet, so I'm going to make a prediction. What I predict is that Jo Jorgensen is going to criticize a welfare or state support program, and Suris, being a hardcore left-winger, is going to immediately jump to the conclusion that she doesn't care about the poor. Because in case you're not familiar with Suris, he's basically an uber left-winger. Like, if I had to describe him in a nutshell, I'd say he's probably just barely right of Vosh. Of course, the mentality of uber left-wingers is that everything good in society has to come from the government. All of society's problems must be solved by the government, so of course if you criticize the government doing something to solve the problem, you just don't care about the problem. Of course, like I said, as of this point I haven't yet watched the video. At this point I'm just drawing inferences based on contextual information.
Alrighty, so today we're going to be talking about JoJo. No, not that one. That would actually be enjoyable. We're talking about this one. Now, this couldn't possibly go downhill or anything. Nothing's going to go wrong.
So any of you familiar with 70s pug rock will probably recognize that as Roundabout by Yes. And this is apparently supposed to be a reference to the anime series JoJo's Bizarro Adventures, which I've admittedly never seen. I mean, I have heard of it. Apparently a lot of memes come from it. Truth be told, I'm not a huge anime person. I mean, there's a few that I like. I like Death Note, I like Naruto, I like Full Metal Alchemist, but it's not something I'm like heavily into the way some of my friends are. So anyways, a lot of Suris videos begin with a few minutes of irrelevant fluff, so we're just going to go ahead and skip right to the meat and potatoes of the video.
Jo Jorgensen. I have been seeing her stuff on my Facebook feed for weeks, and I get it. Nobody really wants Biden for president, and nobody wants Trump for president, at least not in my circles. So we talk about the third-party options, and one of the ones that has come up is JoJo.
Interest in third-party candidates has actually been steadily on the rise here in the United States for quite a while at this point. But I think what really caused interest in third-party candidates to surge was the 2016 election. You know, back when both parties put forward the most shady and corrupt and just sleazy candidates they could. I think that's what brought to the forefront how problematic the bipartisan nature of American politics is. Like, everybody hated Donald Trump and everybody hated Hillary Clinton, and I think that's what caused a surge in third-party interest that we're seeing now. I mean, as awful as the 2016 election was, I think that's probably the biggest silver lining to come out of it. And although I'm not really a leftist myself, I understand why leftists aren't particularly hot for Joe Biden. He's probably like the most centrist, watered-down, corporatist version of a left-wing politician there is.
So I decided to take a bizarre adventure through all of her policy. This is not going to be an exhaustive expose on JoJo, but this is going to hopefully give you guys a little bit of an idea of what she stands for.
I can't necessarily blame Suris for not wanting to go through each and every single one of her policy prescriptions. As Suris does point out, there are actually quite a few of them. But one thing that's interesting to point out here is that in attempting to give us a general idea of where JoJo stands politically, ironically Suris is also giving us an idea of where he stands politically, because the aspects of Jorgensen's policy that Suris decides to share in order to try and present to us a general idea of what her policy positions are like would reveal to us what sort of issues Suris deems important when evaluating a politician. In a way, we'll have sort of an idea of what issues Suris deems more or less important.
What is your stance on abortion? pro-choice. Well, that's at least a good start.
So the exact libertarian stance on abortion is a bit complicated. To go in full detail on it would most likely warrant its own video. But to summarize it, since the core ideology of libertarianism is the non-aggression principle, that is, people have the right to do as they please so long as they're not hurting anyone else, the issue basically boils down to whether or not the fetus is considered a separate person from the mother. Now, I'm probably going to get a lot of dislikes and angry comments for this, but I'm pro-life. And there's two primary reasons for that. The first reason is that there's a pretty strong case to argue for the self-awareness and therefore the personhood of a fetus. Our current physiological understanding of fetal development suggests that the fetus can actually develop significant cognitive capabilities very early on in the pregnancy. The second reason is that it strikes me as kind of unnecessary. I mean, I understand if you don't think you're ready to be a parent yet, but why not just have the kid and put it up for adoption? You know, it's not the kid's fault that the condom broke or you forgot to take the pill. Of course, abortion is kind of a tricky subject. It's something that I'll probably have to dedicate an entire separate video to. And of course, there are sometimes instances where, in order to protect the health or safety of the woman, an abortion is necessary. I do think there should be exceptions when there's an actual medical reason for one. But, you know, murdering your own child before it even has a chance to see daylight, for no reason other than your own personal convenience, something about that just strikes me as barbaric.
Do you support the legalization of same-sex marriage? Take the government out of marriage and instead make it a religious decision. Now, I've got a few problems with this. One of mine is that where marriage is concerned, one of the biggest reasons to do it is for the financial incentives, the tax breaks and stuff like that.
Really? Because I thought the biggest incentive to get married was, you know, because you actually love the other person and want to spend the rest of your life with them. In my experience, marrying someone just for financial reasons is usually frowned upon. Like, if you go around marrying people just for money, you're usually labeled a gold digger, and that's frowned upon. Especially when you consider that marriages that are based on money or some factor other than love usually don't go down particularly well. As a matter of fact, they often lead to shady, underhanded shit, like people marrying someone just to divorce them and take half their assets. On top of that, if you're just looking for financial incentives, it's possible to form legal partnerships without necessarily getting married. In a lot of states, you can actually have joint bank accounts and file your taxes jointly with someone else without having to marry them. See, I think you could actually make a strong argument for separating marriage and legal partnerships, because historically this has actually been the case. Historically, marriage has always been considered a religious function carried out by the church, and partnerships a legal function carried out by the state. The advantage to this is that people who want to form a legal partnership to accomplish something jointly aren't necessarily pressured into doing something as permanent as marriage.
The other issue that I have is that if you leave the ability to marry only in the hands of religious organizations, those same-sex couples are not going to be allowed to get married. Most religious organizations will not marry same-sex couples.
Are you sure about that? Because one of my friends who's gay is actually a reverend at his local church. In a world where churches are refusing to wed people because they're gay, it most likely would be the case that churches would be established to cater to LGBT people. I mean, here in the United States, we just recently got gay marriage legalized in all 50 states, and people had to fight tooth and nail for that. Now, how much easier would that have been if we lived in a libertarian world where at any time anyone could just start a church and start wedding gay people? I mean, that's essentially what King Henry did. King Henry wanted to divorce his wife. The Pope told him no, so he basically started his own church to give himself his own divorce. That's how the Church of England was created. And in a libertarian world where there's no licenses or regulations or shit like that, where it's extremely easy for anyone to just start their own church, I have a good chance there'd be quite a few churches that serve LGBT people. I mean, we already have bars, restaurants, and hotels that advertise as LGBT friendly. Why not churches?
Should gay couples have the same adoption rights as straight couples? Yes, as long as they pass the same background checks as straight couples. Kind of a weird way to just say yes. I'm not sure why there's a yes but there. I would figure that that background check doesn't have a special if you're gay, you're perfect sign, but okay, I at least agree with it.
Now, I do generally agree with this. I believe that any couple or even individual who can demonstrate competency to raise a child should be allowed to adopt. Because you often hear this old myth pushed by conservatives, that children raised by gay couples are less well off than those raised by straight couples because children need both a male and female parental influence in their life. Conservatives often say this, but there's little to no data to actually back that up. As a matter of fact, if that were true, then children raised by gay couples would be no better off than children raised by single parents, and the data doesn't bear that out. So I do generally agree with Suris here. However, I do understand why Joe Jorgensen would want to emphasize that gay couples should have to pass the same background check as straight couples. That's because the left wing often pushes this whole affirmative action type logic, where certain groups of people that they sympathize with should not only get equal treatment, but also special treatment to a degree. Given this has been a pretty prominent feature of left-wing politics in our country, I can't say I blame her for emphasizing that.
Should employers be required to pay men and women the same salary for the same job? And no, according to her, the government should never be able to determine what a private business can pay its employees. On the surface, this is something I want to agree with, which is the case with a lot of things that are libertarian. But, unfortunately, as is also the case with a lot of things that are libertarian, they work under the axiom of maximum freedoms means maximum good. But that's not always the case.
Start off the bat, we see that Suris has a very surface-level understanding of libertarianism. He seems to believe that the core assumption that libertarianism rests on is that maximum freedom means maximum good. And that's a bit of an oversimplification. You see, the actual core assumption that libertarianism rests on is non-aggression, not hurting people. See, I think most people can agree that hurting people is bad. And if we can all agree that hurting people is bad, we can agree that it should be avoided whenever possible. And from this, we get the argument for maximum freedom. You see, restricting someone's freedom entails threatening violence against them, i.e. hurting them. So if we can agree that hurting people is bad, and that hurting people should be avoided whenever possible, and that restrictions on freedom entail hurting people, it makes sense then that restrictions on freedom should be avoided whenever possible. So Suris is correct to point out that maximum freedom is a part of our ideology, but he's incorrect in pointing out where it comes from.
Without some way to regulate the pay of businesses, businesses will exploit their workers. And businesses in the past have exploited their workers just because of the color of their skin or their gender.
So you're going to have to explain what exactly it is you mean by exploit. Otherwise, this argument is pretty much meaningless. See, this is a common strategy used by people on the left. They'll use scary-sounding words to try and make something seem bad without actually having to argue against it.
The libertarian response to this is usually that with competition, you can just go to a different business that's not going to exploit you the same way.
Yeah, and that's usually what would happen. Businesses that would pay people less because they're female or black or whatever would oftentimes have a harder time competing with other businesses that did pay their employees more fairly because less people would want to work for them and therefore they'd have less of a talent pool to draw from. And this isn't even to mention all of the unions that would specialize in representing female or minority workers.
But historically what tends to happen is that all the businesses start playing by the same rules because they know they can, and if they're all playing by the same rules, then it doesn't matter what business you go to.
So here's what Suris is failing to understand here. It's usually not the case that a bunch of businesses in an area just spontaneously decide to all play by the same rules. More often than not, when this happens, it's due to some sort of government regulation. A good example of this is business segregation in the South. A lot of people tend to think that segregation in the South was happening because all the business owners down there just so happen to be racist. And the truth is that very few business owners in the South were actually racist. What happened was the handful of business owners who were actually racist wanted to make sure that they weren't going to be outcompeted by other businesses that weren't. And of course they did what every business owner does when they're afraid of competition. They go to the government and tell them, stop them from competing with us. And so Jim Crow laws were passed which prohibited businesses from serving black people, thus forcing business owners who ordinarily wouldn't have any problem serving black people into enforcing these racist policies. The point to take away here is that in a free market, shitty business practices usually don't stick around on their own. Usually when unethical business practices become widespread, it's either mandated by government regulation, or regulation is put into place to make it more difficult for competitors to come in and undercut those unethical business practices. The idea of all the businesses in an area playing by the same unfair rules to their own accord is very unlikely.
You may be treated marginally better or marginally worse, but the underlying problem of equal pay will still be there without some type of regulation.
So this is a mindset of hardcore liberals like Suris, and it's a theme you'll kind of see repeating throughout the video. This idea that the government and only the government has this sort of magic power to solve all our problems that we mere mortal homo sapiens don't possess. Like if businesses started treating their employees like crap and there was no government to step in, the employees would just sit there and take it because they're stupid or weak or whatever. What would prevent the workers there from starting a union and bargaining for better conditions or equal pay? I mean, we've had unions bargaining for these things long before they were mandated by government regulation. As a matter of fact, regulations actually do a lot to impede the ability of unions to negotiate better conditions with their employers.
This has historically always been the case.
You know, it's kind of funny, whenever liberals say that there's all these historical examples of libertarianism failing, they never seem to be able to give any.
Large corporations are not your friends.
Well, the car I drive, the computer I use, the medications I take, do all come from large corporations. As a matter of fact, there's probably a large extent to which I owe my quality of life to large corporations, so yeah, I'd consider them my friends.
And large corporations are also not individuals. Trying to treat them like individuals to give them maximum freedom does not actually help the individuals whom they end up exploiting later on down the road due to your negligence.
So this is actually an argument that Suris has made in several of his other videos. Businesses are not individuals and therefore aren't entitled to the same rights as individuals. So whereas you and I have a right to discriminate in who we associate with, businesses don't, is basically his argument. Now here's why this argument is stupid. While it is true that businesses themselves are not individuals, they are in fact owned, operated, and run by individuals. All of those individuals have stakes and interests in that business. So when you put restrictions on how that business can operate, you still are ultimately impacting individuals and therefore are impacting their rights. When you put restrictions on how a business can operate, you're not necessarily violating the rights of that business, because since a business is not a sentient entity, it has no rights, but you are in fact interfering with the rights of the business owner who put all the money, time, risk, and investment in that business and legitimately owns it.
But don't worry, I'm sure that Walmart, McDonald's, Burger King, Target, Academy Sports, and practically every other major business would just, as soon as any regulations were taken away from them, start paying everybody more.
Actually, yeah, that's a possibility. I mean, companies spend a fuck ton of money trying to comply with these regulations. Imagine if all that money was free to go into the employees' paychecks instead. Also, Suris is kind of missing the big picture here. It's not just that employees at those companies specifically would be better off in the absence of regulation. It's that the economy as a whole would be better off in the absence of regulation. Because generally speaking, less restrictions on the economy means more opportunities available. You see, one of the reasons that so many people rely on big corporations for their income is because regulations make it harder for smaller businesses to compete. In a more business-friendly environment, if someone was being mistreated at one of these big companies, they could go to the many smaller businesses that are competing, or even perhaps start their own business. You see, Suris is doing what a lot of left-wingers tend to do when they address economic issues. They hone in on one very specific issue within the economy without looking at the economy as a whole.
What a deluded
I
fan.
like how the idea that people should peacefully coexist and get along and not use violence is some kind of deluded fantasy, but the idea that giving certain people within society the unique ability to initiate force against people is somehow the best way to solve society's problems isn't.
And should there be more restrictions on the current process of purchasing a gun? And she says no. Now please, take this with a grain of salt, as this is coming from somebody who is incredibly pro-gun and a leftist, because, well, if you're not pro-gun and you're a leftist, how do you plan on defending yourself from a tyrannical government? How do you plan on engaging in a revolution or anything like that? How do you plan on doing any of that without a gun? You can't. So, again, I'm pro-gun.
I think that might actually be the most sense I've ever heard Suris make. Well, even a broken clock is right twice a day.
However, in the current system, it is far too easy to get a firearm for most individuals.
Now that's bullshit.
Are you kidding me, dude? I mean, maybe down in Georgia where you live that's the case. But up here in Maryland, there's some like absurd 3-week waiting period to buy a gun. And Maryland has some of the most absurd gun control in the country. Like, you need a permit to own a magazine. Not even the gun, just the magazine, you need a permit.
Yes, it varies state by state, but that's something that needs to be handled at a federal level.
Yeah, heavy centralization of the control of all firearms in the country.
What could possibly go wrong?
And the reason is, if you look at our country compared to most other developed nations that have better gun control laws than what we have,
So who wants to bet he's going to do what every left-wing gun grabber does, and cherry-pick specific data that makes his position look better? Like, he's not going to talk about countries that have a higher death rate in spite of more strict gun control. He's going to focus specifically on gun deaths and not homicide rates as a whole. He's going to lump suicide and justified killings in with the homicide statistics. I mean, it's so predictable. It's as if every left-wing gun grabber follows the same script or something.
you find that things like school shootings and stuff like that end up going down in those countries, and gee, I wonder why.
It may have to do with the fact that different jurisdictions classify things like school shootings differently. For example, in some jurisdictions, the gun has to be discharged on campus to be considered a school shooting. In other jurisdictions, if the firearm is discharged anywhere within the vicinity of the campus, that's considered a school shooting. So suppose that there's a domestic dispute involving a firearm discharge that just so happens to take place in a neighborhood where there's a school. In some jurisdictions, that may count as a school shooting. Now, this adds a huge element of variance to the data, but of course nobody on the pro-gun control side is going to mention that.
It's almost like with smart gun control, you can have people who are responsible citizens with guns and firearms that are able to defend themselves perfectly fine, but you can minimize the amount of people who have firearms who are not supposed to have them in the first place.
And who exactly is it who gets to decide who should or shouldn't possess firearms? If somebody's political views don't quite align with the person who's been empowered to make that decision. Your political views don't quite align with mine, so I consider you dangerous and hand over your guns. Having an independent armed militia of the people to challenge the authority of the government is the whole reason we have the Second Amendment in the first place.
And to the conservatives in my audience that say that gun control means somebody's going to come and take their guns, stop being paranoid. Not everybody thinks in binaries like you do.
So this is actually a very common deflection tactic used by gun grabbers. They'll say, oh, we're not coming to take your guns away. We just want to put reasonable common sense restrictions in place, that's all. Well, first of all, that's bullshit. You said earlier in the video, you do in fact think that certain people shouldn't have the right to own firearms, so that's a load of crap. But second of all, and most importantly, this is, like I mentioned before, a common deflection strategy used by gun grabbers. Rather than go into detail and discuss specifically what it is they advocate for, they just want to hide behind buzzwords like reasonable and common sense. Like, sorry gun grabbers, you can't just advocate for things that undermine our fundamental constitutional rights and avoid the conversation by hiding behind what seems reasonable or common sense.
Should the government introduce a stay-at-home order to combat coronavirus? She says no.
So at this point, the answer to this question should be obvious to anyone with a non-negative IQ, basically. We've had over a year now to experience lockdowns across the world in one form or another. Not only do they not actually do anything, like it's been a year, you'd think if the lockdowns were actually effective at stopping the virus, they would have worked by now. But they cause vast amounts of untold suffering. They destroy jobs, businesses, opportunities. They eliminate social gatherings, things like parties, conventions, plays, sporting events, things that give life meaning and purpose. Cause stress, anxiety, depression, suicide, poverty, suffering. Given the massive cost versus the virtually non-existent benefit, you'd have to be either a sadistic sociopath or a complete fucking retard to continue to advocate for lockdowns.
And I think this, as with most libertarian policies, falls into the strange phenomenon of utopian thinking. Here's one of the ones I'm torn on. You see, a stay-at-home order is a very useful tool for stopping the spread of a virus.
It's false.
Except it's not. Stay-at-home orders do very little, if anything, to actually slow the spread of the virus. If you look at the COVID numbers in places that have implemented lockdowns versus places that haven't, you'll see that the numbers actually aren't all that different. For example, California's COVID numbers actually far exceed those of Florida, even though California has locked down and Florida hasn't. Now, some lockdown advocates will point to data that suggests that the number of COVID deaths is lower than was originally anticipated, and I'll use this as an argument as to why lockdowns are actually effective. But there's two assumptions this rests on. The first one is that the original anticipated numbers are actually accurate, and the second one is that the numbers are lower than anticipated due to the lockdowns. Both of these assumptions can be called into doubt.
The problem is, like with a lot of other programs, it requires foundational programs to exist to begin with.
Yeah, that's the problem. In order to function, it requires a big bloated bureaucracy and socialist welfare programs which in and of themselves are unsustainable.
We shouldn't have to spend months and months and months in delegation over whether or not we should get a measly $1,200 to protect citizens from going, homeless.
We should also not be spending months and months in delegation over whether or not we essentially destroy people's lives over something with a less than 2% chance of killing you. I feel like his priorities are a bit off here. He's pissed about the government not handing out money to people to prevent them from going bankrupt, but not pissed about the government causing those people to become bankrupt in the first place.
There should be things like rent and mortgage freezes in place.
This is one of those things that the left has constantly been calling for because of the pandemic, rent and mortgage freezes. So apparently, according to these people, an illness going around somehow entitles you to live in someone else's property for free. Yeah, landlords and financial workers aren't struggling financially right now. They don't have any bills to pay or families to feed. It's perfectly okay to screw them over. Don't worry about how the landlord's going to maintain the premise and keep it habitable without any rent money coming in to fund maintenance. Like, I know the left seems to have a hate boner for landlords for some reason, but can you guys at least take a minute to think through the consequences of what you're pushing for? And how about a freeze on taxes? If it's illegitimate for the private sector to impose debts on people during the pandemic, why would it be any more legitimate for the government? Like, if you proposed a freeze on taxes to help people get by, I'd imagine that these same left-wingers who are calling for a freeze on private sector debts would turn their nose up.
That force everybody to play on an even playing field while they're not able to make any money.
See, this is more or less the mentality of left-wing social justice, equality-minded type people. Instead of fostering an environment that encourages prosperity and success, to make sure everyone is equally crippled. A famous quote from Friedrich Hayek comes to mind. A society that values freedom above equality will end up with both, and a society that values equality over freedom will end up with neither. I think that's what we're seeing right now with a lot of this bullshit that the left is pushing, lockdowns and shit. These lockdowns are causing massive amounts of wealth to flow to the 1%, the rich and wealthy corporations. Kind of ironic how the very policies that the left wing is pushing for is benefiting the very people they also constantly bitch about.
Unfortunately, this means that I'm kind of split down the middle on this. Were we in a better country that didn't have a dystopian view on human life, then I would be disagreeing with Joe.
If we lived in a country that didn't have a dystopian view on human life, then lockdowns wouldn't even be a thing to begin with. You see, things like socialization and entertainment are things that are very essential to human happiness and well-being. Expecting people to go without it for months or even years at a time can cause severe psychological and developmental problems. Heck, right now it's a privilege just to see somebody smile. Like, yeah, let's inflict psychological torture onto people for months at a time to avoid what? A disease that only affects like 5% of the population?
I find myself somewhat agreeing that stay-at-home orders are largely ineffective, though, because our current environment does not support them.
Wow, the land of make-believe.
I hear this argument so much from socialists, that we can just have perpetual, never-ending lockdowns as long as the government just hands out free money. Here's why that's idiotic. You see, that money isn't just conjured up out of nowhere, it has to come from somewhere. Government money usually comes from one of two places, either taxation or printing press. Now, taxation relies on wealth being there in the first place. You can't really tax people if there's no wealth there to tax. You ever hear the expression, you can't draw blood from a stone? Well, if everybody's sitting at their asses at home, if the economy's not being productive, then no wealth is being generated, and if no wealth is being generated, what exactly is it that the government's going to tax? The only other option is to print the money, but you can't really do that indefinitely because the more money you print, the less valuable it becomes. Unless there's magical money-shitting unicorns somewhere that I'm not aware of, I don't see how this plan of perpetual lockdowns is going to work.
Do you support the impeachment of President Donald Trump? She says no, this is a partisan show trial. But the question was not, do you support what the Democrats and Republicans are doing surrounding the impeachment process? The question was, do you support impeachment of the president?
I mean, she did give an answer as to whether or not she supports impeachment of the president, and she did explain her reasoning, and she's 100% right, in my opinion. There's pretty much no legitimate basis for the original impeachment of Donald Trump. It's very obviously just a move by the left wing to try and gain some political clout. I mean, the evidence they have is what? Some weird conspiracy theory involving Russia that's been debunked Lord knows how many times? What I think is funny is that even though now that Donald Trump is out of office, there's still people out there wanting him impeached.
And in the case of the pseudo-fascist president we have here,
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
So of course fascist is liberal code word for anyone who disagrees with me. I mean, of course I don't agree with every single one of Trump's policies, but even I can tell that fascist is a bit of a stretch.
I would assume that a libertarian worth their salt that believes that freedom is an actual axiom they should be working with would think that the authoritarian should be impeached, yes.
So like I said before, I'm not a fan of every single one of Trump's policies. I mean, just like any other politician, I think there's good things that he's done and bad things that he's done. Of course, we can debate and discuss what aspects of Trump's policy are good and bad. That is a discussion worth having. But what you have to understand is that impeachment is a very specific tool for a very specific purpose. You see, the purpose of impeachment is to hold public officials responsible if they abuse their position of power. It's not there to go on a witch hunt against politicians that do things you disagree with. Now, Donald Trump has made some bad policies, yes, but there's other mechanisms in place we can use to address that. So taking something that's meant to be a tool for justice and using it to push a personal political agenda, I feel like that sets a bad precedent.
But I guess JoJo's maybe a bit too much of a coward for that one. I mean, she is the third-party candidate, so I can understand fighting uphill both sides. But if one of those sides is completely and totally antithetical to everything you stand for as a politician, then maybe don't lick the boot on this one.
So, since Suris is an uber leftist, Donald Trump would seem like this authoritarian dictator. I mean, it's almost a given at this point. Anyone who leans even slightly left has to bash Donald Trump. Now look, I'm far from a Trump fanboy. There are plenty of perfectly valid criticisms of Donald Trump that I do agree with. Heck, I've even criticized him on Twitter for being a sore loser about the last election. That being said though, on the whole, I still consider him to be a pretty good president. Got rid of a lot of pointless regulations, he strengthened the economy, unemployment was at an all-time low. As much as people like to claim he's a racist, blacks and Latinos were actually more prosperous under his presidency than under Obama's. Now of course he did some bad things as well. I don't agree with the border restrictions, I don't agree with the military aggression. Like I said, there are perfectly valid criticisms of Donald Trump. You see, at the end of the day, politicians are just humans, like you and me. Just like anyone else in any other profession, they do some good things, they do some bad things. We're all human, we all make mistakes.
Should marital rape be classified and punished as severely as non-marital rape? And she says yes. and consensual sex with a spouse under the age of 18 should be classified as statutory rape.
So here's where I feel that Joe Jorgensen isn't being completely libertarian. He's advocating for age of consent laws. For those of you who aren't aware, age of consent laws basically make it a prima facie crime to have sex with anyone under a certain age. So if you have sex with somebody under a particular age, usually 18, it does vary between state to state, but in most states it's 18, that's automatically a crime, regardless of whatever relevant factors there may be. Whether or not the person consented, whether or not the person was competent to consent, doesn't matter. If they're under that certain age and you have sex with them, that's automatically a crime, and you get in trouble for that. Like big time trouble. Not only can you end up in jail, but you can also end up being labeled a pedophile, having to be put on the sex offender registry. Basically have your entire life ruined, all because you had a consensual relation with someone under a certain age that some politician somewhere decided was acceptable. Now, the reason this is problematic from a libertarian standpoint is because it infringes on what's called freedom of association. What freedom of association basically means is that two individuals have the right to consent to whatever arrangement they both voluntarily agree upon, so long as no third party is having their rights violated in the process. Now, of course, the age of consent does in fact infringe on this right, because it's saying that you don't get to enter into this arrangement that you voluntarily agree to because of the number of times the earth revolved around the sun since you left your mom's vagina. Now, of course, I do understand the purpose of age of consent laws. They're there to try and address sexual exploitation and abuse of minors. It's something that I'm in no way trying to defend or downplay at all. I think that shit's sick, and those people who do that need to be held responsible. But you see, the problem with age of consent laws is that they kind of operate on the assumption that everyone develops the competency and understanding to consent to sex all at the same age. And that simply doesn't comport with reality. Different people develop differently. Some people might be competent to consent to sex at a younger age, some people at an older age. It all depends. You see, not only does linking competency to consent to sex directly with age often end up with perfectly legitimate and fair relationships being thrown under the bus, but it also doesn't address situations where someone might be above the age of consent and still not competent to consent to sex. It's possible that someone might have some kind of developmental disability wherein it takes them longer than most other people to comprehend and understand things, which means that even though they would be above the age of consent, they're still in a condition where they're vulnerable to be taken advantage of by someone. There is precedent for this. There have been cases of someone taking advantage of someone's mental disability to try and get them to have sex with them. Under age of consent laws, this person isn't technically doing anything wrong as long as they're above that age. I think most of us would agree this is problematic.
Hey, now, I was with you at first. Marital rape should, in fact, be punished just like non-marital rape. However, there is the caveat that you decided to answer about statutory rape. Now, while in most cases, yes, I do believe that if somebody is 17 and there is an adult trying to get into their pants, that is in fact a problem.
I mean, why exactly is it a problem? I mean, if the 17-year-old consents and the adult consents, where's the problem? If you can demonstrate that there's some aspect of this relationship that makes it problematic, for example, one of the parties' consent was obtained through duress, or one of the parties lacks the mental capacity to consent, then yeah, I would agree that relationship is problematic. But absent any sort of affirmative evidence that this is in fact a problematic relationship, I don't think the ages of the participants alone does anything to invalidate the relationship.
But there are some instances where you need to consider that that's not actually the reality of what's happening. You can have somebody who's 6 weeks older than another individual, and so eventually, de facto, they will be 18 before the other individual is 18. They will be 18 for a grand whole 6 weeks. During that 6 weeks period, if a parent just doesn't like the boyfriend or doesn't like the girlfriend for whatever reason, they can then get them jailed for statutory rape through just being vindictive. I personally know people who have had the parents of their spouses that they would later have who have threatened them with that when they went to high school with their spouse.
So here's another thing that Suris is actually correct on. Because of how heavy-handed these age of consent laws are and their absolute total prohibition on any sexual relations with anyone under a certain age whatsoever, it kind of lends them to be abused for nefarious purposes. Like Suris mentioned, these can be used by vindictive parents to try and throw someone who's in a relationship with their child they don't like under the bus. Another thing that I always thought was kind of unfair about statutory rape is that it's only the older person who gets in trouble. Like if a 19-year-old and a 16-year-old consent to have sex, a 19-year-old gets in trouble and a 16-year-old is off the hook. Isn't that kind of unfair that only the older person gets in trouble? What about the younger person who consented to that relationship when they weren't supposed to? Aren't they just as responsible? I mean, there have been stories of people getting nabbed for statutory rape because the younger person lied about how old they are. As a matter of fact, it's actually been used to blackmail people before. Someone would say that they're 18, have sex with someone, then say, actually, psych, I'm 16, and then basically use that as grounds to blackmail them. Because if you're in that situation, there's nothing you can really do about it. Having sex with someone under the age of consent is illegal, period. Bottom line. Whatever other relevant factors may have been in play at the time.
This strikes me as something that's coming from a good place, but the end result is going to harm people who are actually causing no damage and doing nothing wrong.
I do appreciate that Suris at least understands what some of the problems with age of consent laws are, but he seems to be making a rather arbitrary distinction between relationships that started while both parties were under 18 and those that started when one of the parties is over 18. It seems to me like you would have the same problem whatever age the parties were at when they decide to enter into the relationship. Like suppose a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old hooked up. Wouldn't the same problem of parents leveraging the legal system for vindictive purposes still be there?
This is why we have things like Romeo and Juliet laws.
One of the problems with Romeo and Juliet laws is that they only protect relationships that began while both parties were under 18. Like I mentioned before, if one of the parties was over 18 at the time the relationship began, then usually these protections don't apply. More importantly, I think that Romeo and Juliet laws are more of a band-aid solution. They don't really address the main issue, which is that we tie competency to consent directly with age, and I think that's problematic. Here's my opinion. If it can be proven that someone is incompetent to consent to have sex, the other person was aware of it, and that the other person knowingly and intentionally took advantage of this in order to have sex with them anyways, then and only then should it be considered rape. This should apply across the board to everyone of every age. So not only adequately make sure that those that sexually exploited people were held responsible, but it would do so in a way that wouldn't throw legitimate relationships under the bus.
Should the government order schools to be closed in order to combat coronavirus? She says no.
There is a little bit of an aspect of nuance to this question. Since public schools are owned by the government, I think that's their call to make whether they want to close them or not, but I definitely don't think the government should have the right to order private schools to close.
Because, yes, allowing the one place that is a constant hot zone for infectious diseases to constantly run rampant with people with little to no regulation is perfectly A-okay in JoJo's mind.
So you do realize this logic could be applied to any other disease, right? Because Suris is correct to point out that schools typically are a bit of a hot zone for illnesses to spread. You know, you have a bunch of young people in close proximity to each other all day in the same building for hours at a time. You know, my mom's actually a school nurse, so I know a thing or two about this. But, you know, there's been illnesses and diseases going around long before COVID, and somehow schools managed to operate just fine. And here's a little something that might possibly blow your mind. Are you ready? Kids who are feeling sick can actually stay home for a day to make sure they don't get everyone else at school sick as well. Like taking a day off when you're sick. I know that's some kind of new crazy concept, but just hear me out, alright?
Who cares about the teachers that are basically going to be sacrificing their lives on the way there? And who cares about grandma that your kid's eventually going to kill when they come back with a deadly virus? Nah, we should be free to sacrifice our educators on the funeral pyre of freedom.
But what if the educators or that grandma consent to the risk? I think most grandparents would be okay being a little bit more at risk to exposure to an illness if it meant their grandchildren could get a proper education. Just because you don't determine the risk to be worth it doesn't give you the right to impose that risk judgment onto everyone else. Like if you want to barricade yourself inside for the rest of your life to protect yourself from a disease with a less than 2% chance of killing you, knock yourself out, but the rest of us got lives to live. On top of that, he's making the same mistake that a lot of lockdowners make, which is portraying the risk in a binary way. Like either we lock down and shut down everything permanently or kill millions of people. There's no in-between or gray area for these people. Like, so what's preventing the schools from requiring masks, or spreading the desks further apart, or wiping things down and disinfecting things between classes? I know a lot of you are probably going to say, well, why can't they just go learn online? I do support the idea of there being online education as an option for people who are more vulnerable or don't feel comfortable going on the physical campus. I don't think you can get rid of in-person learning entirely. There are actually several reasons for this. One reason is that some people don't learn as well online as they do when they're on campus in person. Back when I was in college, we often had a choice between taking our classes online or on campus. I tried to take my classes on campus as much as possible. I liked being able to directly see and hear the teacher, and being able to directly get feedback if I didn't understand anything. There's several other advantages you get from being in person that you don't get from online, such as the ability to directly communicate and collaborate with your classmates to form study groups. And you're not completely shit out of luck if your internet goes bad. So there are certain subjects that can't be taught online. What about things like cooking or archery or automotive repair? No, those are things where you have to physically interact with something in order to learn a skill. You can't really do that behind a computer. Most importantly though, people, and especially younger people like children, need social interaction. A lot of kids are actually begging to go back to school just because they miss interacting with people. Like I'm 23 and having to live my life through a computer is wearing down on me. Can't imagine imagine how it would be for younger people. A lot of kids are actually committing suicide because of depression caused by the prolonged social isolation. Like, would Suris think that's okay? Like, sacrificing our teachers and elders to a disease with a 2% chance of killing you is unacceptable, but sacrificing young people to suicide is just fine, apparently.
Should the government increase environmental regulations to prevent climate change? She says no. Okay, so this is either coming from the position of more freedom's more better, the more free everybody is, the more better everything is, which is the libertarian position in the United States.
Actually, the libertarian position is non-aggression. Don't hurt people, leave people alone. It's amazing how many videos there are of people who criticize libertarianism without ever mentioning the non-aggression principle. Like, you'd think since that's the main thing that we'd believe, it's the main thing that they would be criticizing, but I don't know.
Or this is coming from the position that climate change isn't real and therefore anti-science.
I like how the word science has been co-opted by the left as a sort of buzzword to describe their cultish adherence to narratives, as opposed to an objective analysis of facts, which is what science is actually meant to be. If you don't buy into the narrative on climate change, if you question it however slightly, then you're just anti-science. The truth is that climatology and climate science is a bit more complicated than the left makes it out to be. You see, climate is a very complex thing. A lot of different factors contribute to it. For example, did you know the Earth actually goes through natural cycles of cooling and warming? Or that the average temperature increase due to man-made carbon emissions is only like a fraction of a degree? Like, it's so slight it's practically negligible. Or that before people were fear-mongering about global warming, they were afraid of global cooling. They were actually afraid man-made carbon emissions would cause another ice age. Then they changed their story to global warming. If you ever mention any of these simple facts to a climate alarmist, they'll label you anti-science and treat you like some kind of crackpot.
If we look at one of her other policies, we can figure out which one it is. Should the US acquire Greenland? In which she says no, the US should also drastically reduce its global footprint. So at least she is coming at this from the perspective of somebody who's not a climate change denier. She's actually accepting the scientific consensus on climate change. However, she is engaging in reality denial. If you believe that the United States should be lowering its carbon footprint,
I think Suris is a bit confused here on what she means by global footprint. Since the question was to whether or not the United States should acquire Greenland, I think she meant footprint as in military aggression.
and that carbon footprint is mostly contributed to by large industrial organizations, but you're not willing to do anything to actually stop them from lowering their carbon footprint, then what do you actually expect to lower that carbon footprint? You want it to go away, but you don't want to do anything about the problem.
Well, first of all, the question was whether or not the government should increase environmental regulations to address climate change. Just because she doesn't want to increase regulations may not necessarily mean she doesn't want to enforce the regulations that are already there on the books. So this answer can't necessarily be construed as her being against environmental regulations. But let's give Suris the benefit of the doubt and assume that she is 100% against environmental regulations. This still doesn't necessarily mean she doesn't want to do anything about the problem. I've mentioned this earlier in a video, but Suris and hardcore left-wingers who think like Suris have this mindset where the government necessarily needs to solve all our problems, and if you don't want the government to do something about the problem, then it means you're just apathetic about the problem. But what you have to understand, though, is that ultimately at the end of the day, government is just a group of people. They're not gods, they're not magic, they don't have any special abilities that you and I don't have. They're just people in an office somewhere who push papers, that's it. Truth is that we, the people, have actually a lot of power to do things to improve the environment. There are tons of environmental nonprofits out there of people volunteering their time to go out and do things like pick up trash, promote recycling, build small-scale wind and solar projects, educate the public about climate change. Instead of waiting around for a politician to do something, how about you get off your ass and actually go do something?
What do you think is going to fix this shit? Fairies?
Well, yes, specifically the nuclear power fairy. See, there's a very telltale sign to tell whether or not climate alarmist is actually genuine in their concerns or is just seeking political clout, and that is whether or not they support nuclear power. Anyone who even remotely gave two shits about climate change would support nuclear power. You see, not only is nuclear power cost-effective and reliable, but nuclear reactors actually don't produce any carbon dioxide, none. Now, of course, the process of mining and enriching uranium produces a little bit of CO2, but that's heavily offset by the CO2 reductions you get from the reactor itself. You see, France actually uses more nuclear power than any other country in the world. And the French not only have some of the lowest electric bills in the world, but they also have the lowest carbon emissions because of electrical production. Now, there are slight risks from radiation leakage or meltdowns, but modern reactor designs are so safe that the chances of there being another Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island happening is very low. Now, I'm not against things like wind or solar power. I think they have their applications. I think they can work as a sort of supplemental form of power. But these forms of power are less reliable and more expensive. You just don't get the same bang for your buck as you do with nuclear. Nuclear is cost-effective, reliable, and low carbon. The only other forms of power that really fit that bill are hydroelectric and geothermal, but those aren't available everywhere in the country and have their own environmental issues. Bottom line, you're not going to power a city like New York using just wind turbines and photovoltaic panels. It's not happening.
Like, no, I'm serious. Do you, as a person, as a thinking, breathing human being with brain cells that plug together to make synapses actually give you the ability to think, do you, as that person with that capacity, believe that businesses that do not have a profit incentive for lowering their carbon footprint...
So notice how he just makes the assumption that companies don't have any profit incentive to lower their carbon emissions, but he never gives us an explanation as to why that's the case. I mean, there's plenty of historical precedent as to the profit motive doing things to improve the environment. For example, the beef and oil industries used to actually dump their byproducts into the water. But because of the profit motive, these companies were actually able to find useful things to do with these byproducts. Not only did this improve people's quality of life, because now there's more products available than there were previously, but it also improved the environment because it meant those byproducts are no longer being dumped into the water. Who knows, maybe one day an entrepreneur will come along and find a useful way to reuse the CO2 emissions that come from factories and power plants. I mean, research has been put into it already.
Are going to actively engage in that without us, the people, doing something about it, through the only mechanism that us, the people, have ever had to do anything. Democracy or revolution. And if you don't like democracy, well, everything can just go on fire. That'll help the carbon footprint, right?
Well, you know, Suris, the free market is pretty democratic. Like, you get to decide who you do business with. Nobody forces you to do business with anybody. Because of that, you get to directly vote for what business practices you support. If a certain business is polluting the environment, then just don't do business with them. Do business with a company that's more ecologically friendly and you can support that business practice. This is how democracy works in a free market. People can vote for which business practices they want to support by choosing what business to go to.
Should health insurers be allowed to deny people who have pre-existing conditions? And Joe says, yes.
Well, yeah, insurance companies are private businesses. They can implement whatever policy they deem fair, and if you disagree with that, you can get a policy with a different insurance company.
Okay, if you're going to believe in a policy like this, not insuring people who have pre-existing conditions and not doing anything about businesses that engage in that kind of practice, which basically means that people who are disabled are incredibly fucked. Like, if somebody loses their insurance at their job and has to get private insurance 20 years down the line after they've been having their issue dealt with through their insurance company that they've had at their job, and the private insurance is allowed to say, no, fuck you, then they're screwed for the rest of their life.
What Suris doesn't seem to understand here is that what we want is a free market for health insurance, where everyone involved is free to make the decisions that they feel work best for them. While that might mean that an insurance company can tell a disabled person, fuck you, it also means a disabled person can tell the insurance company to fuck you, I'll find a different insurance company that will help me out. On top of that, another thing you would have under a free market for healthcare is what's called a health insurance account, or health savings account. Basically, it would work similar to an IRA, like you would designate a certain amount of each paycheck to be set aside into this separate account. You get all the other perks that come with an IRA, such as your employer matching a certain percentage of your contribution. It would be tax deductible. It's basically an account that you can draw from whenever you need health care. Whenever you get sick, you have that money there available to you. Now, the biggest advantage to a health savings account over traditional employer-provided insurance is that just like an IRA, you retain that money if you were to leave the employer. In my opinion, this is actually a pretty elegant solution to the common problem that liberals often complain about, that leaving an employer often means losing your health care. Under this type of system, you would still have all those benefits you would get under employer-provided insurance, but you still get to hold on to them if you left for that employer.
And you, as an individual, you, as a person, would have been the one to enact a policy that let that happen.
Actually, I'm pretty sure the insurance company is the one who enacted that policy that let that happen. Like, you're trying to blame the government for a policy that a private insurance company enacted. I mean, what's with this idea that the government's supposed to be everybody's babysitter? Like, anytime somebody does something shady, the government's supposed to step in and do something about it. Like, grown-ass adults are too stupid to figure out these things for themselves.
Through no fault of the disabled person, through no fault of their own, they are completely and totally screwed under this system. Something like this can only really be supported if you're willing to allow a government or single-payer option so that people can get the help they need if they're screwed in any other capacity.
So Suris doesn't seem to understand what single-payer means. Single-payer healthcare is a monopoly. It's the government saying we and only we will cover these certain things. If the government is covering something, no private sector insurance plan is allowed to cover it at all. That's what single-payer is. It's not a choice, it's an elimination of choice. Now, I'm not necessarily against the idea of there being a government-run insurance program there as an option for maybe poor people who can't afford private insurance, but it should be there as an option, not something people are forced into.
Do you support a single-payer healthcare system? She says, no, the government should not be involved in healthcare. At all. Full stop.
While I'm not necessarily against government healthcare at all, I am definitely against single payer, because single payer is a monopoly, and it comes with all the problems that monopolies usually bring, such as increased prices, lack of availability, lower quality service. Personally, I'm more of a fan of the multi-payer system, similar to what they have in Germany, where the government-run insurance plan is there as an option, while private insurance companies are still allowed to operate. The reason I like this system is because you kind of get the best of both worlds. You still have a free market for health insurance, you still have the freedom to decide which insurance plan works best for you, while the government insurance plan is still there as an option for maybe poor people who can't afford private health insurance.
So, yeah, if somebody is disabled, they're completely and totally screwed. No government help for them at all under Joe's system. If you're disabled, or if you have any type of pre-existing condition at all, you're completely and totally fucked.
You guys probably are picking up on this sort of theme going on by now, but basically in the mind of Suris, if the government isn't doing something, then that simply means nobody does it. If the government's not providing healthcare to poor people, then poor people are just fucked. I mean, back before Medicaid and Medicare were passed, there were things like mutual aid societies and charity doctors. Not only did these things do an excellent job of taking care of poor people who couldn't afford healthcare, but they don't have the nasty side effect of increasing healthcare costs the way a lot of big government programs do. You know, I bet whenever Suris takes a shit, he sits there on the toilet like, oh man, the government's not here to wipe my ass for me.
And if you want to say that, oh, well, just find an insurance provider that won't have pre-existing condition clauses, unfortunately, most insurance providers are going to do what they can to get their profits, and that includes not accepting people with pre-existing conditions.
So people on the left tend to complain about the fact that insurance companies typically go after healthier customers and avoid sicker customers. There's actually a reason for this. It's the same reason that car insurance companies typically go after safer drivers as opposed to people who've already wrecked their cars. You see, the literal definition of insurance is it's something that you buy when you don't need it, in case you do need it. Because insurance, by definition, is something you buy before you need it as opposed to when you need it, it makes sense that the primary market for insurance would be healthier people as opposed to sicker people. You see, insurance works by creating a pool of money. A bunch of people sign up for a policy, they pool all their money together, and if something happens to one of those people where they need to draw from that money's there for them. In order for that to work, however, there has to be more money being paid into the pool than there is being drawn from it at any given time. If people could just retroactively take out policies for issues they already have, well, that completely removes any sort of incentive to pay more into the pit than you're drawing from it.
Libertarians like JoJo tend to think of businesses as individuals, and all individuals left to their own devices would try to make the world a better place for everybody, but businesses are not like individuals. Businesses are generally predatory.
Predatory how? By voluntarily entering into arrangements with people to improve their quality of life? You act like the government isn't predatory at all. You know, the people have to take money from people by force because nobody's willing to pay for their services voluntarily. Like, they're not predatory at all?
They are faceless companies that are trying to do nothing but increase their bottom line. Under unregulated systems like this, businesses get to thrive while individuals get to suffer. And since businesses aren't people, there's only a handful of individuals under that business that get to actually thrive.
So there's actually two mistakes that Suris is making right here. First, he's treating businesses as autonomous entities separate from the people who own and operate them, which I've already explained the problem with that earlier in the video. But he's also speaking as if businesses thriving and individuals thriving are somehow mutually exclusive. If one thrives, that's necessarily at the expense of the other thriving, and that's not really the case. The fact that Suris is framing the issue this way tells me that he doesn't understand fundamentally how the free market works. In a true free market, absent any state coercion, transactions only occur because they're mutually beneficial. That is to say that both parties gain more from the exchange than they had before the exchange, otherwise the exchange wouldn't have happened. By definition, everyone is better off in a free market. Now suppose you want the government to redistribute somebody's wealth. The government threatens someone with violence to hand over their money in order for the government to hand that money to somebody else. In this case, somebody does benefit from this, but unlike in a free market exchange, the benefit isn't mutual. The benefit is at the expense of somebody else. And that's the key difference here. The free market makes everybody better off, where the government makes certain people better off at the expense of others.
You create the material conditions for a much worse world, and this is an issue that I've had with the libertarian position for a while now. This is because that position works under a single axiom: personal freedom.
Actually, it's that hurting people is bad, and if you wear a fancy badge and call yourself a government, then hurting people is still bad.
But personal freedom for yourself is not the only axiom we should be working under when constructing morals, and therefore when constructing laws.
I would argue that morals and laws are things that exist naturally and are not constructed, because if you're going to make the case that morality is something that's synthetic or constructed, subjective, then you're kind of making the claim that it's arbitrary, and therefore your moral claims have no greater weight than mine, since it would just come down to opinion at the end of the day. I think the stronger position to take would be that morals are kind of like mathematics. It's something that you can prove objectively using logic, although not empirically verifiable.
When you work under a system like this, you eventually find yourself in the situation where every man is an island, and any policy that does not treat every man as an island ends up getting thrown under the rug. But policies like that can end up having a net benefit to society that helps everybody survive. Hell, in cases like with climate change, it literally helps the planet survive. But nah, fuck all that! My freedoms! That's what's important.
So Suris here seems to be perpetuating another common myth about libertarianism, which is that libertarianism is super individualistic, and that's not necessarily the case. We believe in individual rights and liberties, and we think people have the right to be left alone if they're not hurting anyone, but that doesn't necessarily make us individualistic. Of course we believe in social interaction. I mean, humans are a social species after all. Of course we're going to communicate and work together and accomplish things as groups. We would just prefer that it be done voluntarily. Just because I don't think individuals should be forcibly subjugated into a collective doesn't necessarily mean that I'm against collectivism, period. Of course people are going to work together to achieve the common good. It comes with benefits that trying to do everything yourself doesn't. Thus there's a very clear incentive for people to do this, absent state coercion.
Thanks, Joe. Should the government regulate the prices of life-saving drugs? Joe says no, the government should never regulate the prices of private businesses.
I've mentioned this earlier in the video, but this has to do with freedom of association. Basically, if a buyer and seller voluntarily agree upon a price that both determine to be fair, then it's not legitimate for any third party to arbitrarily butt in and interfere with that.
Right. Because I can't think of any possible negative side effect that would come from allowing a business to do anything for profits.
Yeah, I don't think the question was, do you think businesses should be able to do whatever the fuck they want for profit? I think the question was, do you think the government should be able to regulate the prices that they charge? Like, those are vastly different things to claim.
And allowing a business to, say, put the price of something like insulin so astronomically high that people with diabetes have to choose between insulin and food, or insulin and rent, or insulin and the vehicle they use to get to work so they can actually provide a living wage to their families.
You do realize that in an actual free market without any regulations or government interference, if someone decided to jack the price of something way up, they'd immediately be undercutted by their competitors. The only reason that big companies can charge astronomical amounts for certain medications to get away with it is because they have a patent, which is basically a government-granted monopoly, meaning that any competitors that could enter the market and provide it at a lower cost are prohibited from doing so. And I think the same could be said for all those other things you listed, like housing and cars. In a free market without regulations where competition is not restricted, these things will generally be more affordable and accessible. In particular, I think housing is an excellent example of how the government artificially makes things expensive and unavailable. Take things like zoning laws, which restrict the ability of developers to build more housing, or rent control, which basically removes the incentive for developers to go in and build more housing in an area.
But they're not going to get a living wage because people like Joe don't support a minimum wage, much less a minimum wage increase.
There's a specific reason that libertarians tend to be against the minimum wage. It's a forceful third-party intrusion onto a voluntarily made agreement. And that's not even getting into the fact that, according to pretty much every single economic study on it, the minimum wage does cause unemployment. But there are problems specific to the idea that the minimum wage should be a living wage. Two of them in particular come to mind. The first one that immediately comes to mind is, well, you have to define what a living wage is. This is kind of tricky, given that the price of living can vary significantly depending on quite a few different factors. What you would consider to be a minimal standard of living is also subjective. For example, you can't actually survive living on nothing but navy beans. Navy beans do contain all of the nutrients that you need to survive, so if you ate nothing but navy beans the rest of your life, you could live. But I have a feeling that wouldn't be good enough for Suris. The other problem is that not every job is really intended to support an entire family. A lot of high school and college kids are just looking for a way to earn some extra scratch to pay their tuition or maybe go out and do some fun things with their friends. A lot of these people aren't necessarily working to put food on the table. If employers were suddenly obligated to provide every single one of their employees a high enough wage to support a family, what are the odds that those high school and college positions would stick around? This is one of the biggest problems with the minimum wage. It gets rid of the most important jobs, which are entry-level jobs.
This is the problem when the only axiom you're working under is freedom.
It's not. It's non-aggression. But go ahead and continue with your straw man.
And I hope that this list, as inexhaustive as it is, shows kind of that thread. If it is about personal autonomy and personal freedom, and it can lead to a good, you will probably agree with the position that Joe has, or the position will lead to a common good, like something like being able to be pro-choice, policing your own body, having bodily autonomy. But there are negative and harmful positions that can be taken when you work under freedom as your only axiom, when you have no way of measuring net good or net positivity.
That's because there isn't really a way to measure net good or net positivity. Those are subjective concepts. You see, the biggest problem with the utilitarian ethics position that Suris here is taking is that it relies on taking concepts that are ultimately subjective, like the greater good, and treating them as if they're objective. When you accept that it's legitimate to interfere with an individual's freedom, personal autonomy, in pursuant of some greater good, you kind of open that whole Pandora's box of, well, who gets to decide what the greater good is? That could mean different things to different people. Like, he mentions abortion again, and I think that's a primary example of where this issue comes into play. Suris is pro-abortion because he thinks it involves the woman's right to make decisions about her own body, bodily autonomy. I'm against abortion because although I do believe in bodily autonomy, I think that your body ends at the umbilical cord. Once you hit that umbilical cord, that's a different body. If there was such a thing as an objective greater good, we obviously wouldn't be having disagreements like this. And this is my biggest problem with utilitarianism. It takes ethics and turns it into a contest to see who can exercise the most muscle in pursuit of what they personally believe to be a greater good. Have a consistent principle of ethics that you can build a society on. I think you do have to be deontological and respect individual rights.
If only personal freedom is what matters, and you do things like grant individuality to corporations instead of treating them like mechanisms for good or ill, then you wind up in situations where corporations are able to exploit people with life-saving medical drugs, or exploit people by preventing them from getting care when they desperately need it.
So, Suris, let you in on a little secret here. If you want to make medication more available, then restricting the price of that medication is like the exact opposite of what you want to do. Because when you put a price cap on that medication, it reduces the amount of profit that companies can make by selling it, and thus reduces the incentive for them to make that medication. If you want to increase the availability of medication through government coercion, you would actually want to do exactly the opposite. You would want to regulate the price of every single commodity in the economy except for that medication. Because what that'll do is it'll make everything else in the economy so unprofitable that the only thing companies will want to do is produce that medication.
If everything is privatized and everything is private business, and private businesses are treated as individuals with their own autonomy...
Nobody's advocating that businesses be treated as individuals. That's a straw man. Again, the only one here who's really trying to treat businesses as separate autonomous entities from their owners is you, Suris.
Then we get this situation where people are denied healthcare, where people are denied certain rights.
Wait, how would privatization deny people their rights? Like, privatization actually respects people's rights to personal autonomy and private property. Like, I think Suris is using the word right as a buzzword, as opposed to how the word is originally intended, which is something left-wingers tend to do. Like, rights are things that you have inherently, by virtue of being a sentient, self-aware entity. If someone else has to give them to you, then they're not rights, they're privileges.
All in all, this is the reason why I'm not going to be voting for a libertarian, especially not Joe.
Well, I mean, a lot of libertarians don't believe in voting anyways. We don't believe that your individual rights and personal liberties should be at the mercy of public opinion.
Do I think she's a bad person? Probably not. But I do think when the only thing you care about is freedom, you lose the bigger picture. That's not to say freedom isn't important. Again, I mentioned earlier, stop thinking in binaries. Just because I don't find freedom to be the most, utmost, importantest, most bestest thing in the entire world covered in fucking chocolate, doesn't suddenly mean that I do not value freedom.
I feel like by pointing out that different people value different things differently, he's actually making the case against utilitarian ethics. Because remember, utilitarianism rests on the idea that you can in fact determine an objective greater good that applies equally to everybody. Yes, people value different things differently. I think that's why we should have a system in place where everyone has the freedom to pursue what they feel to be worthwhile, so long as they're not interfering with the rights of anyone else.
If you constantly think in binaries, you're being a child. Or I guess you're being Obi-Wan's version of a Sith. Only Sith deal in absolutes, right?
You know, it's kind of ironic how he criticizes libertarianism for thinking in binaries, and that's pretty much what he's been doing this entire video. Like, how many times has it been the case that Joe Jorgensen said the government shouldn't do anything about this problem, and Suris immediately jumped to the conclusion that that means nobody should do anything about the problem.
Either way, if you want an exhaustive list over all of her policies, then I will have a link to that in the description below, and you can make up your own mind. After you've done so, please let me know in the comment section below what you think.
I'll do you one better, sir. I'll make a response video.
Like I showed in here, there are some policies of hers I agree with, and there are some policies of hers that I think are incredibly freaking damaging. And almost all of that stems from the fact that they're working under one axiom.
Actually, almost all of that stems from the fact that you seem to equate the government not doing anything about a problem to nothing being done about the problem. You seem to have the opinion that a lot of other left-wingers have, which is that the government has some kind of magic ability to solve our problems that we mere mortal Homo sapiens simply don't possess. These policies only seem incredibly damaging to you because you are thinking in that mindset.
This is not a robust moral system. This is not a robust system for making a set of laws.
The purpose of law is to defend people's rights and maintain social order, not to service your agenda specifically. I like to think the role of government is kind of like a referee. Their job isn't to give one team an advantage over the other, just to make sure that both teams are playing by the same set of rules.
This is a very childish system. It is a selfish system.
Hey pal, you just blowing from Stupid Town?
So look, if Suris doesn't agree with libertarianism, I'm okay with that. You know, this is a free country with free speech. Everyone's allowed to hold whatever opinion or belief they want. If it's one that I disagree with, hey, that's fine. But I do think it's kind of intellectually dishonest of him just to write off libertarianism as childish and selfish. Especially if you consider what it is we fundamentally believe. We think people have the right to be left alone. We don't think it's okay to coerce or hurt anybody. And we think that their individual rights and autonomy should be respected. It's actually a pretty non-selfish thing if you think about the core of what it is. If you compare this to Suris's position, where he thinks that if he can't afford something that he wants, he should be able to whine and throw a fit and have the government steal on his behalf to have him pay for it. You know, wanting to steal from other people, wanting to threaten other people with force so you can have things your way. In my opinion, that's childish and selfish right there.
I think I'm actually going to end this on some words from the late Christopher Hitchens on libertarianism. From a C-SPAN interview from several years ago, Christopher Hitchens says, "I've always found it quaint and rather touching that there's a movement, libertarians, in the United States that thinks Americans are not yet selfish enough." I don't think I can end on any better words than that.
I hear a lot of people who criticize libertarianism throw this quote around as if it's some kind of super intellectual, enlightening refutation of libertarianism, but it's actually super retarded. The people who want the government to forcibly take wealth from you, those aren't the selfish people. The selfish people are the people who think that people should be left alone as long as they're not hurting anybody. I can't imagine the amount of mental knot twisting you would have to do to convince yourself that that's true. But anyways, I figured I'd offer a closing of my own. While this video does give us an idea of Joe Jorgensen's policy positions, I think it also gives us an eye into the mind of Suris. We now know, for example, that Suris believes that only the government can solve certain problems. He believes that keeping what you earn is selfish, but taking what other people earn isn't. That businesses that voluntarily consent with you to improve your life are predatory, but the government that literally only exists through theft isn't. His conception of ethics doesn't involve individual rights or autonomy, but some conception of a greater good that all of us should be forcibly subjugated into. In summary, we know that Suris is a hardcore left-winger, but hey, you know what? This is America. People can hold whatever views they want. As long as they're not hurting anyone else, I'm cool with it. So, you do you, Suris. This has been Philosophossum making stupidity play dead. Until next time, have a good one.